Get you on my side. I was looking back through some photos of when I came to Amsterdam before, and I found this one. I was like, look at that huge cloud of smoke. What a time I had. And then I realized it was just from fireworks. So I'm going to talk to you about CSS animations and transitions. I'm going to break it down into a few different parts. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the past. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the present. But I'm going to break that down a little bit further. I'm going to talk about transitions, animations, performance, touch on that, and something about soft skills as well. And when I say talk about this stuff, I mean partly talk and partly complain. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of animations as well. So start off with obviously a trip down the memory lane. We'll go back to the past. People have been doing animation for thousands of years. These cave paintings in France, apparently if you hold a torch up to them, they flicker and provide the illusion of movement. So since people can draw, they've been animating. And there have been some great moments in animation. This is Edward Muybridge's experiments with photography when he realized that you could crank these things and make them go into the appearance of motion. And then the high point probably of animation in the 20th century, Roadrunner. It's my absolute favorite. So animation's got a long and distinguished history. Animation on the web, not so much. I'm going to little quick run through of the history of animation on the web. Bear in mind that this is just from the most cursory of research. We've got people here who actually invented CSS and stuff, so they'll doubtless find a few issues with my timeline. But it goes back to something like 1993, when we had the Mosaic browser, which implemented the image element, which meant we could do animated GIFs. So probably the first animation we had on the web, I'd imagine, was animated GIFs. A few years into the future, 1995, Netscape Navigator 1.1, Internet Explorer 2, the marquee element. What a world of opportunities that opened up for us. But at the same time, we also had Embed, which allowed us to bring in plugins like Java, so we could put photographs of a lake and put fake ripples underneath it. And Flash later on. And then in 1996, I wish I hadn't made these so small, I can't read them. In 1996, Internet Explorer 3, script, JavaScript, or script, what was it called, JScript at the time. Suddenly that allowed us to do amazing things. This brought into us what was this is how I learned to animate, Dhtml. If anyone here is old enough to remember Dhtml, what a time that was. Excuse me. So you would directly do the movements in the browser with this. And then a few years after that, along came some of the common libraries like Jquery and MooTools, and made it all a little bit easier, provided methods for us to do the same stuff. But then there was a big, big, long gap until probably, let's say, 2007. Yeah, 2007, Safari 3 introduced animations and transitions, the things we know today, so animation through CSS, through the style rule. So we have today animations and transitions, two different specs. They're actually both currently in working draft, so they're not technically a standard yet, although they're implemented across every modern major browser, so they've become a kind of a de facto standard. Even been unprefixed in many cases, but they're not officially part of CSS. They're still in working draft, as it were. But anyway, we have animations and transitions in CSS. Hooray! Except the implementation is complete, it's not in accordance with the spec, and has many, many bugs. But otherwise, yes, hooray! So I'm going to talk you through some of that. It's going to be a little bit of an introduction to animations and transitions, just in case you don't know them, but it's not going to dwell on that too much. Start off with transitions. Transitions are WebKit prefixed in Safari 6 and below, and I think unprefixed everywhere else. They're unprefixed in Firefox, certainly, in Internet Explorer. Safari 7 will unprefix them. Opera, yeah, I think everywhere apart from Safari or WebKit-based browsers, they're still unprefixed. They are unprefixed. And a transition at its most simple looks like that. I'm not going to overdo the transition stuff in the slides, I promise. That was my one cheap shot. So the most basic transition you can do is you can apply the transition property with a time. You don't need to specify anything else. All you need is a time to say that this transition will take place over this amount of time. But the transition property that you see there is just a shorthand property, and it's short for four different sub-properties. The first of which is transition property. The second is transition duration, transition delay, and transition timing function. So let me drill down into each of those individually for you. The transition property, the default is all, which is why in the transition shorthand you don't need to specify anything. If you don't specify anything, it transitions everything that changes between two states. Everything that can be transitioned will be transitioned if you don't specify it. You could also specify a property or a series of properties, which we'll come back to later. So you could say only transition the background color, or only transition the height. Or you could say none, don't transition anything. It's not that useful in CSS unless you're disabling something, but it's possible, it's there. The transition duration, by default, is 0. No transition happens, which is why you have to specify it to make the transition shorthand work. The other values it takes are either n seconds or n microseconds, milliseconds. So 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds. And all that is the length of time over which the transition will occur. Super simple. Transition delay is used the same syntax, default 0. And this delays how long until the animation occurs. So if you set a delay on it, there will be a delay of that time, and then the animation will begin. The interesting thing about this is that you can give it a negative value. You can set a negative delay on something. And what this does in effect is it kind of jumps to that point in the animation, or even pulls, imagine it pulls the animation. I'll illustrate it for you. So say this is a transition. You're going to go on through this series of frames, and it starts where the green line is there. If I set the transition duration, that should be delay, beg your pardon, that's my typo. Transition delay should be -1 second, and then it will kind of start from that point. So when it finally does start, it will just start as if the animation's already been playing for that amount of time. So it is quite useful. Then it starts to get complicated. A transition timing function takes 3 types of value. The cubic Bezier function, the steps function, and a series of keywords. I'm going to have to drill down into this because this is where it does start to get a little bit kind of loopy. And to explain what a cubic Bezier graph does. So here we have a graph, and along this axis, it goes from 0 to 1. And along this axis, it goes from 0 to 1. And on this chart, we're going to plot 4 points. Well, we're not actually. We're going to plot 2, because 2 of them are pre-plotted for us. The first one is known as P0, and it takes place at 0, 0. And the second one takes place at what's called P3, and that sits at 1, 1. And the animation will plot a line between those two. So at the moment, that's a smooth line. So it will be a single, smooth, unvarying transition. No speed ups, no speed downs, nothing at all. Just a single, linear transition. What the cubic Bezier function does is you see it has 4 values. The first pair of values plot the point of P1. So in this case, it's at 0.1, 0.35. And the second pair of values plots the second point, P2, which is at 0.9, 0.7. And then through the magic of cubic Beziers, because I don't understand this, so that's why I'm calling it magic, those 2 points distort the line. And they vary the speed of the transition. So what was a nice linear smooth transition has now become, it kind of accelerates towards the beginning and then speeds down to a little towards the end there. So that's cubic Beziers. They're quite simple when you don't understand them, like me. So to make it easier for people like me who don't understand them very well, there's a series of keywords which just set predefined cubic Bezier curves. There's this one called ease in, so you can see it starts off slow and then speeds up. There's one called ease out, which does the opposite. And there's one called ease in out. So it starts off slow, speeds up, and then starts off and then finishes slow again towards the end. So all those keywords are just shorthands for different points on the cubic Bezier graph. These screenshots are taken from Leah's fantastic cubic Bezier tool. And if you're interested at all in defining your own cubic Bezier functions, go to cubicbezier.com. It's absolutely wonderful. You can play around with it and generate your own super, super easily. So there's also the steps function. Steps, nothing to do with the pop group Steps from Great Britain. So that reference probably hit about 3% of you. Steps they also do an animation, but it's kind of plateaued. It's not a smooth single animation. It goes in little fits and starts. Here you can see I've said steps 4 and start. What this means is on the first, so it'll divide the animation up into little jumps. So it'll move at the beginning of the first portion, then pause, then move at the beginning of the next portion, then pause. I'll show you a demo in a second. And there's steps end, which does the opposite. So there's a pause and then a movement, a pause and then a movement. It's a very fine distinction. Probably a little easier if I show you an example. The one at the top has got the start keyword and the one at the bottom has got the end keyword. When I animate them, you can just see the one below pauses, then moves, pauses, then moves. The one up top moves, then pauses, moves, then pauses. So those are stepped animations. And there are a couple of keywords for steps as well, a couple of extra steps. There's step start, which means the animation will go in one movement only, and it'll animate at the beginning of the duration of your transition. So if it's 1 second, it will animate and then pause for 2 seconds before the transition ends. And step end does the opposite. So again, it might be helpful if I show you a little example of that. The one at the top is the step start keyword, and the one at the bottom is the step end keyword. So this is a transition taking place over 2 seconds. You can see the one at the top, step start, moves immediately, then pauses. The one at the end pauses, then moves, before the transition comes to an end. Of course, it's not that simple. You can add more stuff to it. You can do multiple transitions as well. So you can just comma separate a bunch of different transition value sets. So in this case, we'll transition the height over 1 second and we'll ease it in. And at the same time, we'll transition the color over 1.5 seconds, and that will be a nice, smooth, linear transition. You can also do them in the separate properties if you want to, so you can list them out there. Height and color, 1 second, 1.5 seconds, transition timing function, ease in. That's not actually exactly the same as the slide I've showed you before. This time I've only put one value for transition timing function. If you supply a lesser number of values on any of these properties, they basically loop through them. So in this case, the ease in will be applied to both transition properties over both transition durations. But you can do some quite clever stuff with that looping. If I show you a slightly more complex example, say we've got 4 transition properties, A, B, C, and D, and then we've only got 3 transition durations, X, Y, and Z. What will actually be output is AX, BY, CZ, DX. So D, because there's 4 values, the transition duration will loop back to the beginning again. So it will use X again. So you could actually use that to your advantage, that looping. I've never done it, but you could. Pop quiz. Is that a valid value? What was that, sir? No, it's not. You're absolutely right. Well done. That is not a valid value. So I beg your pardon, it is a valid value, but nothing will happen. Because if you specify none anywhere in those bunch of values, no transition will happen. It overrides everything. Another one for you. Will this one work? You again, sir? Yeah, that's right. It will. That one absolutely will, even though there's no property called gorilla. I wish there was. There's not. I've got all the members of the working group, the CSS working group down here, and I've got all night with a few beers to convince them. I don't know what it'll do yet, but I just want to have gorilla in there. So this is what the spec says. Unrecognized or non-animatable properties must be kept in the list to preserve the matching of indices. So what that means is it will ignore the one that it doesn't know, but it will still keep it in that comma-separated list because we have that looping. So how do browsers actually implement that? Well, here's how Firefox does it. Okay? So it's transitioned the color, which it's supposed to do, but it hasn't and at the same time, we've set the width to change. I should have specified this. We've set the width to change, but haven't specifically added a transition to it. So what we should see is what Firefox does here. Is that the change of color is transitioned, but the background change is not. What actually happens in Chrome is this. Okay, no, it's now animating or transitioning the width of the box as well. And that wasn't anywhere in our list of values. And that's kind of because, given this, Firefox will basically ignore the rule that doesn't apply. Whereas in WebKit and Blink, not just Chrome, sorry to single you out there, not just Chrome, in WebKit and Blink, it basically animates everything. It treats it as if it's all valid. So I might have just flummoxed the Chrome team with a bug live on stage, in your face. I shouldn't have done that, because he'll probably be fielding questions for me at the end. Okay, so animations work in a kind of a pretty similar way. Animations, they are equally supported as transitions, but they are still prefixed in Chrome and Safari. Unprefixed, I believe Chrome are working on it, it's coming soon, but unprefixed in IE and Firefox, and even Safari 7 will not unprefix animations just yet. Animations, you kind of can think of them as a series of transitions, chaining a bunch of transitions together, that's all it is. And you start by defining some keyframes. I've given mine the name of chimp there. This ID, this unique ID, basically has the same rules as an ID selector. So it's a single word, unquoted, you can use hyphen or underscore, but you can't put a number at the beginning of it, just like an ID selector. Actually, inspired by what Tab was saying earlier, you can actually use Unicode as well. So that is a valid keyframe identifier, my little skull and crossbones. But that wouldn't be, that's the most simple set of keyframes you have. You just need some kind of destination. That's essentially a transition. But of course, you can make it more in-depth than that, more complicated, more complex. So you specify a bunch of keyframes and different things that will happen in each keyframe. And you specify them as a series of percentages from 0 to 100. I think you can actually leave some of them out, and it will automatically transition to the end. To just make that a little simpler, there's a few alternate keywords. So 0% is interchangeable with the keyword from, and 100% is interchangeable with the keyword to. So keyframes are basically selectors. And like selectors, you can use compound ones. So you can use from, comma, to, and the rules inside there will apply to both. So it's just like in all the best CSS, DIY, don't repeat yourself. You don't have to list out every single thing in a different keyframe every time. What happens if you specify something in the first keyframe and not in the last one? Well, the spec says if a property is not specified for a keyframe or is specified but invalid, the animation of that property proceeds as if that keyframe did not exist. So if I have this occasion where I specify border width 10 in the from frame and border width 1 in the to frame, but nothing in the middle, it will just transition across the whole thing. And that's not the way it used to work. Certainly when Firefox first implemented it, if you didn't include it, it would reset the whole property. It would take it back to its default value. So that's fixed, that's worked. So you can transition things across the whole. You don't have to specify them in every single keyframe. Again, do not repeat yourself. And the simplest way to call the animation once you define the keyframes is this. The animation property with the name of the animation, which we've already defined before, and the duration, which is identical to the transition one. This is the minimum viable animation property. You don't need anything else. But just like the transition property, there's a lot more to it. And with the animation property, there's a lot more to it. You have the animation name, which we've just seen. The duration is identical to the transition duration. The delay also works in exactly the same way, and the timing function works in exactly the same way. So the differences come in these new properties. We've got an animation iteration count. That's just about as simple as can be. You either give it a number, so you say, run this animation 10 times, or you give it the word infinite, so run it forever. There's an animation direction. I'm going to cover that in more detail in a second. Animation fill mode, likewise, and animation play state. So again, I'll just drill down into those, but I'll drill down into the ones we haven't already met in transitions, because there's no point. Oh, sorry, one extra thing. The animation timing functions, which we saw before, you can actually apply on a per keyframe basis. You don't have to have a single timing function that controls the whole animation. That's not how it works. The animation timing function in these cases will animate from this frame to the next frame. So you can apply one if you want to in the last frame, but it won't. It's got nothing to transition to, so it doesn't work. Nothing happens. But you can set different timing functions on each stage of your animations, of your keyframes. So animation direction works kind of like this. There's 4 values: normal, alternate, reverse, and alternate reverse. Normal plays the animation from start to finish, and then if the iteration count is more than 1, or if it's going to play again, so it plays it through once, then it goes back to the start and plays it again, and back to the start and plays it again, but always in the same direction. That's the default behavior. Alternate does exactly the opposite. So it plays through from start to the end, and if it's got another iteration to go through, then it'll turn around and play from end to start, and it'll keep going backwards and forwards like that. Reverse works in the same way as normal, but in reverse. Yeah. So it will start from the to frame and work back to the from frame. And alternate reverse will do the same as alternate, but in reverse. So whoever came up with this spec, I have to congratulate them on the plain language they've used for all the functions and values. I'm going to play a little demo of how the different values work now. If you're photosensitive, you might want to look away, because I didn't choose the colors very well. Okay, so you can see normal and alternate there, and then they're swipping around. And okay, that may not have been the clearest demo I've ever made. Maybe I should have broken them out into 4 separate ones and played them through. It's too late now. One little tip on that. If animation direction has a value of reverse or alternate reverse, the value of animation timing function is also reversed, which means ease in becomes ease out. So as you play alternate, beg your pardon, I've put that wrong as well, that should be alternate. Should have checked these before I did this. So if you play alternate, when it plays back through, no, I'm right, it is reverse, beg your pardon, I'm completely wrong. Ignore me. Who invited this guy? Yeah, I know. When you play something in reverse, if the timing function set on it is ease in, it will actually play as if it's ease out, because it's playing in reverse. That's all I meant. Okay, animation fill mode is probably one of the hardest to explain. It's not actually that complicated, it's just hard to explain. It's got a few different values. None, which is, I think, the default, and then it goes backwards, forwards, or both. Backwards will apply the properties in the from keyframe before the animation begins. I'm going to explain this visually. Hold on with me, bear with me. Forwards will apply the properties in the to keyframe when the animation ends. And both will apply the properties in the from keyframe before the animation begins, the properties in the to keyframe when the animation ends. Hold on for the visual. Okay, we've got an element which is blue. That's the color we set on it in the CSS. And then we have an animation which is going to change it from yellow to red. So in the to keyframe it says yellow, and in the from keyframe it says background color red. And the animation looks like that. So the animation name doesn't matter. It's going to run over 1 second. There's going to be a 1 second delay. What will happen if we set the animation fill mode backwards is that in that 1 second delay before the animation begins, the div will be yellow, because it's inheriting the value from that to keyframe. And then the animation will run, so it'll transition to red, but then at the end, it will default back to its initial blue state. If we set animation fill mode forwards, it will start off in that 1 second pause in its default blue state, and then when the animation begins, it will turn yellow and then transition to red. But if we set to both, you never see that blue state. It starts off yellow and it ends red. So animation fill state is basically a way of saying what happens before this starts and what happens when it ends. Actually, that wasn't so hard to explain after all. First spec violation here. When the animation duration is 0 seconds, animation fill mode still applies. Not in any browsers I've tested. You can set animation fill mode and a value of 0 seconds, nothing happens. Those are in the key browsers that I've tested. Final value in animations is the animation play state, which is either running or paused. I think you can see where I'm going with this one, right? The animation is either running or it's paused. Again, plain naming, well done. Multiple animations. Again, you can set as many animations as you want on a single element. So I've got animation called 1, a keyframe set called 1, and one called 2. That will come in confusing later. And then I'm setting the animation. I'm saying run 2 for 1 second, comma separated 1, 1 for 1 second. What do you think is going to happen here? Considering it's got background color specified in 2 separate animations, what will happen at the end is that it will be 200 pixels wide and it will be red. And that's because the animation keyframe set 1 was specified last in the long selector chain, so that takes priority. That color takes priority. You can chain together loads of different animations at different timings, different number of iterations, with delays, with different directions. Very good luck with that. One thing that's a bit rubbish, no keyframes view in DevTools. It's yellow, but it's telling me it's blue. Lol. So what elements actually can we transition? Very simply, the properties that can be transitioned are generally those which accept a quantifiable value. So a length, a color, a number, or a percentage. That covers almost everything. The auto value is not quantifiable. So if you have the auto value set to something, you can't transition to or from anything. This has caught me out a few times. If you have a div and you want to transition, and you've specifically set its height to be auto, for example, you can't transition its height to anything else. You have to set it to a value because it has to be able to transition between 2 quantifiable values. But you can animate stuff inside the calc function, which you've seen already a few times today, because they're just quantifiable units that go inside there. There are a couple of rules which don't follow that. The most strange one I found, maybe not strange, but unexpected one I found, was visibility. Visibility can be hidden or visible, but you can still transition it. But there's no gradual, it doesn't happen gradually. It basically happens like step start or step end, whichever one you've set the direction on. So you can transition, it will start, if there are other elements, the transition will occur, and then at the end, it will become invisible or visible suddenly, which could be quite useful. Here's a quick example of that. Boom. So the transition run, and then right at the end, the visibility just toggled, and off and away it went. Some properties will be implicitly transitioned as well. So properties which are affected by the change in other properties will also be transitioned. If you set font size and transition that, anything which is affected by font size, if it's in EMs, for example, the margin, or the padding, anything which is dependent on the font size will also transition, except in IE10 where only line height gets transitioned. I'm not sure why that should be. You can transition properties applied to the after and before pseudo elements. Note the asterisk. So you can get some nice shiny effects like that. That's just running on pseudo elements, which is very nice. The asterisk is there except in Safari. I don't know about Safari 7, but certainly Safari 6, you can't animate the pseudo elements, generated content in the pseudo elements. You can transition multiple background properties or anything which has multiples, anything which is comma-separated lists. You can transition all of those, and they'll all transition separately. The only caveat with that is the transition timing function you use will apply to all of them. You can't make them transition over different time periods or transition in different rates or speeds. They'll all be transition timing function and duration will apply to everything that's on there. So in this case, I'm going to transition some background position, some multiple background position values to get flying kittens, which is everybody's favorite. There you go. What about gradients? The spec says gradients must have the same type, radial or linear, and same number of stops in order to be animated. No browser I've tested complies with this yet. You can transition the background position of them. You can transition lots of things, but you can't transition the gradient itself. Certainly not in my test. Should that have happened?
I wouldn't be surprised if no one's done it yet.
Okay. I think work is in progress in a few browsers. It's not there yet. Another thing that is transitionable, which is perhaps slightly less expected, is SVG. If you have SVG documents embedded directly into your markup, they become part of the DOM, you can transition them. Certainly you can transition parts of them anyway. In this case, I'm transitioning the fill color of the rectangle. I've also put in a little bonus transition in there. Doink, look at that. So that's an SVG file that's being animated by CSS. There are JavaScript hookings for this as well. There are a series of events for JavaScript. Transition end, or in WebKit transition end. Sorry, in Safari, beg your pardon, or WebKit in general. Transition end will fire when the transition ends, plain speaking. Transition end is pretty useful. It brings with it a couple of new properties, a couple of new attributes which you can play around with. Time elapsed will tell you the exact time of the transition. You've already specified that yourself, so that may not be that useful, but it'll tell you anyway. And it'll tell you the name of the property that was transitioned. When you transition shorthand properties, such as padding, the transition end event fires for all of the individual properties. So it will fire padding left, padding right, padding top, padding bottom. The only exception to that is in WebKit and Blink, where if you explicitly state that you're transitioning padding, only the padding event will fire. But in Firefox, if you specifically state that you're transitioning padding, it will still fire all 4 transition end events. Firefox also doesn't fire the transition end event when pseudo elements are transitioned, which Chrome does, and well, Safari doesn't because Safari doesn't support it, but Chrome does. When you transition pseudo elements, it will fire events for those. And it also has a pseudo element attribute which will tell you which pseudo element was transitioned, but again, that doesn't work in Firefox because it doesn't transition them. When you use the all value for transition property, the implicit transitions that fire the transition end event vary between browsers. Remember I said if you animate some things, other things get transitioned as well because they're dependent on that. There's some quite strange behavior, especially, again, from Firefox, which fires some, I guess, logical but unexpected properties. If you transition the color, for example, the transition, and this is what happens in Chrome, you get returned the color property. But if you do that in Firefox, you get returned the text decoration color, the column rule color, the border top color, right, left, bottom color. So it fires 7 events. Sorry, it fires on 7 events, which is, again, logical. They're all color-based. I guess it does make sense. I just wouldn't expect them to be fired at that time. The thing I would say in that case is just be wary of transition end. It does fire unexpectedly in some browsers. I've heard reports of it not firing at all at the end of some transitions, but I've never found that myself. So just check it very, very thoroughly when you use it. For animations, there are a bunch of different events. There's the animation start, animation iteration, and animation end. Can you guess when they get fired? Okay, you're correct. They also bring a couple of new property attributes that you can hook into. There's the time elapsed, which is the same as with transitions, and there's the animation name. So this will tell you the name that you defined of the set of keyframe animations that has been fired at the time. Again, a little weirdness with Firefox, at least in my tests. The animation start event doesn't fire if the animation begins before the DOM content is loaded. which seems logical, except it does fire in Chrome. So if you have an animation that's set to start as soon as the page is loaded, you won't get an animation start event firing in Firefox, but you will get it in Chrome. I don't know which one's right. Maybe they're both right. Maybe I'm wrong. Also, the animation end event doesn't fire when the animation iteration property has a value of infinite, which seems kind of logical because, you know, it's infinite. There is no end to it. That's what it means. But that didn't stop me from wasting 15 minutes trying to debug why it wasn't happening. Remember earlier we mentioned this, when the animation duration is 0 seconds, animation fill mode still applies. But that's not the end of the quote. It actually goes on a little bit more and says, also animation events are fired. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen at all. No browser currently does this. It's in the spec, but it's not what happens. I probably need to talk about performance because everybody loves to talk about performance. Paul Irish did some good tests on, memory usage of position top left versus translate, which ones are more effective. And he says this: his finding was use CSS keyframe animation or CSS transitions if at all possible. The browser can optimize painting and compositing big time here. Big time. Chrome uses graphics acceleration automatically for transitioned elements. So does Internet Explorer 10. I'm not sure why I mentioned it there. There was no bias on my part, I assure you. But in Safari, especially for iOS, you may have to force it because it does make a difference in performance, according to many tests that have been run. For whatever reason, they don't GPU accelerate every element whenever. I'm not sure what the selection criteria is, but I know there used to be hacks to force this to happen. And then iOS 6, they actually shut down a bunch of these hacks to stop people from doing it. But you still need to do it in some cases because it does affect the performance. If you do need to do it, you can. I think this still works. Just set it to rotate Y, and that will force it onto the GPU layer. Just do use it sparingly because they obviously don't want you to, so there must be a very, very good reason for that. But, just don't take the piss, I guess. However, semi-opaque or transparent elements may see little tangible benefit from the rotate Y hack and could even reduce performance. There seems to be a much bigger performance hit when you try and when you move around semi-opaque or transparent elements. I'm sure there's fantastic reasons for that, which Tab will be happy to tell you all about later. But you're probably asking the question, so, should I use this or should I use JavaScript? And the answer, of course, is it depends. Try it and see what happens. Run tests on it, see if you get good performance out of it. If you do, if the performance is better, then do what you're going to do. I know some people argue vehemently that JavaScript can be much better in terms of performance. These guys, famous, they've got this amazing tech demos of using JavaScript, which they claim is much, much better performance that you could ever get with CSS alone. But I haven't evaluated it. It's a closed beta, so I really don't know. The only test I have run very recently of my own was comparing CSS3 to jQuery. I animated opening 200 boxes at the same time, which is a common use case. You may not have used it, but one day you'll use it. You can see this is using the memory profiler in Chrome. So there was an increase of about half a meg's use of memory, and it just one time put it onto the GPU layer, I guess, and then it was just smooth transition, very, very little. You can see the same animation done in jQuery. It's a lot more jagged, there's a lot more memory use going on there. It's also a lot higher. So in that circumstance of opening 200 boxes at the same time, which does happen, CSS is a clear winner in that. But I guess the real thing from this is just run this yourself. Run this yourself. So I wanted to talk very briefly about soft skills. I said I would. Animation is behavior. When we learned about animation and transitions coming into CSS, everybody was like, wait a minute, we've always said there's markup and presentation and behavior, and JavaScript does this, and never the twain shall meet. And animation kind of is behavior. It's kind of user experience, and it's kind of behavior, and it's kind of decoration. It's all kinds of things. But it does behove you to kind of think carefully about when you use it. A couple of good articles I've read recently. One of them talked about using animation to provide a kind of an element of time in what you're doing. This is a good quote. Animation can help to provide context. So it helps brains understand how information flows. And he gives this nice example of a little thing that he's built. When you insert something new into a long list like this, instead of just pushing it in there, use a little bit of anticipation, open up something first and show what's going to happen, then the person is aware that something's going to happen in that space. And it's just a case of just, using it in a very smart way just to prime people that something's going to happen here. This is one from me. If you do use animations, speed it up. People aren't on your site to admire your animation skills. They're there to achieve an aim. I know when you do animations, the tendency is to go, well, let's make this run over 6 seconds because it looks amazing. If I've just clicked a button and I want something to happen, I don't want to wait for your animation to end before it happens. You know what I mean? So just reduce everything by 2/3 and then halve it and then knock a second off, and then you'll be down to more or less the speed of how fast your animations are going. In terms of technique, years ago, a bunch of Disney animators wrote this amazing book, The Illusion of Life, and then with like fundamental animation techniques. The 12 basic principles of animation they talk about here, which are squash and stretch, exaggeration, staging, anticipation, motivation, second reaction, overlap, follow through, balance, timing, rhythm, and camera movement. I'm not going to stand here and go into what they mean. There's some fantastic articles online which explain these in detail, but I'll give you one very quick example, and that's exaggeration. We talked earlier about cubic Bezier curves, and with the cubic Beziers, they actually accept values that can be, although they're supposed to go from 0 to 1, they do accept some values which are slightly out of range. You can see here the final value I put of 1.25, which is beyond what's technically allowed by that 0 to 1 grid. What that will look like is this. So you can see it actually goes above the top line of the 1 and then snaps back down to it, kind of rubber bands back down to it. You can see this in action in the bottom one. You can just see that kind of little bit of rubber banding, and that's the exaggeration that we were talking about, the animation effect. Just gives it a little bit more weight, it gives it a little bit more body. And there's so much stuff you can learn about from these animation techniques, which are really, really clever. Another great source of animation is anime. These guys, like very tight budgets, they make frames work really, really hard. They animate stuff so well. You can just see simple movements of just backgrounds and things, providing depth of speed. Honestly, one of the best things you do, watch the Pokemon TV series, because that was super low budget, and they had to stretch it out for half an hour, so they repeat so much stuff, and it's amazingly clever, the stuff they do. I'm not going to talk about this now. I'm going to talk very, very quickly about the future of animations. The web animation specification is solve some of the problems that we have and some of the problems you didn't know we had. For example, this is how it works. Is very simply this. It creates a new method called animate. Inside there, you put the things you want to animate and the time over which it should happen. It's very much based on jQuery's animate, but it kind of runs natively in the browser. It's part of the browser API. You can do very, very clever stuff with it, like create whole timelines, provide different playback rates, slow down how often it plays. So there's a lot more coming, and I wish I hadn't run out of time because I'd love to talk to you about that a little bit more. But if you get 5 minutes, grab me and I'll show you on my laptop. So I will come to the end of my talk. There's all this amazing stuff coming. I don't even know what this stuff means, but it sounds really exciting. Synchronization and parallelization, my God. I can't wait till we have that in JavaScript. Why haven't we had it before? A couple of good examples of sites you can use. Again, catch me later. I'm really, really sorry for running over. So I have to say thank you very much for listening to me. Cheers. Time for questions? Yeah, okay, do we have any questions? Can you show us the rest of your slides? Yes, I'd love to. No, okay. Go on, give us your questions. No questions. Okay.
Well, then you can, if there's really no questions, you can talk for a couple of minutes.
Oh, there's one, sorry.
Hiya.
Hi.
You mentioned that you can't animate to auto.
Yeah.
Do you know whether or not that's ever potentially going to be resolved? I'm waiting for Tad to answer, I
wish there was someone here I could ask a question like that.
Because obviously there are situations where you might want to expand an item's height to whatever its native height is without specifying an absolute value.
I project my voice a little. Sorry, go.
So the answer is yes. We do want to allow you to, the issue is, Right now, you can only transition between computed values.
Your accent's gone funny.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm not really British, you see. It's all fake. But there's a technical term in CSS, computed values and used values, and it describes the way a value changes as we do more work. And right now you can only transition between computed values, but auto doesn't become a length until used value time. And we do want some way to opt into that behavior so you can use used values and it just works correctly, but that'll probably be in transitions level 2. So.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions for Tab? It's quite all right. Because if he wasn't here, I'd be going, maybe, who knows? Let's see what the future holds. No, in that case, I'll take my leave of you. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.